Everything you were taught about the birth of civilization is a lie. For more than a century, the official story has been comforting. Humans leave the caves. We invent farming. We build villages. And only then, once life is stable, we finally have the luxury to raise temples to the gods. But there is one place on Earth that turns that timeline into dust. Right now, we can map every cut mark in 3D, and the clearer it gets, the stranger it becomes. In the hills of southeastern Turkey stands a limestone ghost, an impossible monument built thousands of years before the pyramids of Giza, long before Stonehenge, and roughly 6 millennia before the first wheels ever rolled. Its name is Göbekli Tepe, Belly Hill. And it isn't just an ancient site. It's a historical crime scene. Because Göbekli Tepe shouldn't exist. To understand why it terrifies mainstream history, we have to jump back to the mid-1990s. A German researcher, Klaus Schmidt, arrived at this dusty hill expecting something small. Maybe a Byzantine outpost, maybe a medieval cemetery. Instead, when the soil began to peel away, the earth gave up its giants. Colossal T-shaped pillars emerged, carved from single blocks of limestone, some standing nearly 20 feet tall, some weighing as much as 20 tons. Not crude boulders, not accidental stones, engineered monuments, and they weren't random. These pillars were arranged in huge circular enclosures, stone rings like open-air cathedrals. In many of them, 2 taller pillars stand at the center, facing each other like silent rulers, while smaller pillars line the walls as if the space was designed for a ceremony we can no longer name. Here's the problem that keeps historians awake at night. These pillars were raised around 9,600 BC, a time when, according to every textbook, humanity was supposed to be incapable of anything like this. We were meant to be scattered hunter-gatherers, nomads. No metal tools, no writing, no cities, no kings, no organized engineering. Yet Göbekli Tepe screams organization. To quarry, shape, and drag 20-ton monoliths across uneven terrain would require a coordinated labor force. Hundreds of people moving as one body day after day. Who called them together? Who fed them? Who kept them working? And how did they plan these enclosures with such deliberate geometry, so precise that some researchers argue the circles weren't placed by convenience, but laid out according to a larger design? Then the details get darker. These pillars aren't just supports, they're stylized beings. Arms carved along the sides, hands meeting at the waist, a belt, a loincloth, and yet no faces, as if the builders wanted to show a body, but refused to reveal the identity. And across the stone surfaces, a nightmare zoo. Scorpions, serpents, spiders, boars, foxes, and birds of prey watching. The carvings don't feel decorative. They feel like warnings, a language of threat, etched into stone. This wasn't a quiet garden. This was a place of command, which brings us to the smoking gun. For decades, the mantra was, first the farm, then the temple. Göbekli Tepe flips it. First the temple, then the farm. Because here we have a monumental ritual complex from an age before confirmed large-scale agriculture, meaning the drive to gather, ritual, belief, ceremony may not have been the product of civilization. It may have been the trigger. Maybe humans didn't settle down because they got good at farming. Maybe they farmed because they were forced to, because they needed to feed the workers, the builders, the pilgrims, the crowds assembling at this sacred hill. Religion didn't come after civilization. Religion may have built civilization, but now we reach the question that chills the blood. If a society or a network of tribes could accomplish this 12,000 years ago, where did that knowledge come from? And why did they bury it, not abandon it, not let it decay? They intentionally entombed their own masterpiece, covering it in layers of earth, sealing it away as if they were hiding evidence from the future. So in the next chapter, we're going to follow the trail upward, away from the dirt and into the sky. Because some researchers believe these symbols may be linked to a catastrophe that scarred the planet. A sudden celestial event that shattered climates, shattered communities, and may have nearly erased humanity from the earth. Göbekli Tepe is the monument that survived. Now we have to ask, what destroyed everything else? Because if Göbekli Tepe is the monument that survived, then something happened to the world it came from. And the first clue isn't buried in the dirt, it's written in the sky. Around the time these enclosures were rising, near the end of the last ice age, Earth went through a shock so sudden it still doesn't make sense. The climate was warming, glaciers were retreating, and then, almost like someone flipped a switch, the planet plunged back into deep cold. Not gradually, not politely, abruptly. This period has a name, the Younger Dryas, a final, brutal return of Ice Age conditions that lasted more than 1,000 years. Rain patterns shifted, ecosystems collapsed, megafauna vanished, human groups scattered, adapted, or disappeared into silence. And here's where the story turns dangerous, because one controversial hypothesis claims the Younger Dryas wasn't just climate, it was impact. The idea is simple and terrifying. A fragmented comet or multiple pieces of a cosmic body may have slammed into Earth or exploded over it, triggering firestorms, darkened skies, and a chain reaction that wrecked the planet's balance. Let me be clear, this is debated. Some researchers argue there are markers in sediments that suggest an extraordinary event, microspherules, unusual spikes in certain elements, signs of extreme heat. Others say the evidence is inconsistent and the impact theory doesn't hold up. But even the argument itself tells you something important. At exactly the moment humanity was trying to build a future, the sky may have turned hostile. Now look back at Göbekli Tepe through that lens. This isn't a temple in a stable world. This is a temple built on the edge of a nightmare, because the carvings at Göbekli Tepe don't show peaceful animals. They show predators, venom, teeth, stingers, a catalog of threat etched into stone as if the builders were trying to fix terror in place so it couldn't move, couldn't change, couldn't be forgotten. And then there's the strangest theory of all. Some researchers suggest the pillars may not just be art, but memory, a record, a warning system left for people who didn't exist yet. There is one specific enclosure, one specific stone, often pulled into this debate, a pillar covered in symbols that some interpret as a coded sky map. The claim is that the animals may represent constellations, and the arrangement may point to a date, an event, something that happened above. Again, interpretation, not confirmed fact. But ask yourself this: why would hunter-gatherers, people supposedly too early for complexity, cover their most sacred structures with symbols that feel intentional, repeated, and obsessively consistent? Why do so many carvings focus upward, toward birds, toward vultures, toward creatures that live between ground and sky? And why, in a place built for ritual, does the imagery feel like it's documenting fear, not celebrating comfort? Because if a catastrophic celestial event struck, it would have done something more devastating than destroy bodies. It would destroy certainty. Imagine the skies burning. Imagine nights that glow the wrong color. Imagine the sun dimmed by dust and smoke. Imagine seasons collapsing into chaos, harvests failing before farming even exists, animals migrating into absence, rivers shifting, familiar patterns vanishing. Now imagine you're human in that world. You don't have science. You don't have explanations. You have stories. You have ritual. You have desperate meaning-making. A sanctuary on a hill suddenly isn't a luxury. It's survival, a place to gather, to coordinate, to plan, to hold on, to speak to whatever power you believe sits behind the sky. And if the event kept repeating, or if aftershocks echoed through generations, then the temple becomes more than worship. It becomes a command center for reality, a place where memory is stored, reinforced, and protected. Which brings us to the most haunting possibility. If the builders believed the sky had turned against them, they may have built Göbekli Tepe as a response to trauma, a monument designed to lock a lesson into stone. We saw something, we lived through it, never forget. But then, something changes, because after centuries of construction, expansion, and ceremony, after more than 1,000 years of use, the site is deliberately buried, not destroyed by enemies, not reclaimed by nature, entombed by human hands. That decision makes more sense if the world outside had become unstable, or if the knowledge held here had become dangerous in the wrong hands. Or if the builders believed the safest place for the secret was underground, away from the eyes of the sky itself. So, here's where we go next. If Göbekli Tepe was a response to catastrophe, then we have to ask a harder question. How did they do it? Because fear doesn't move 20-ton stone. Human organization does. If the sky broke their world, who taught them to build something that could outlast it? Here's the uncomfortable answer. Nobody taught them. They learned by doing, then repeated it for centuries, until stone became their language. And this part isn't myth, it's evidence. Göbekli Tepe is re-identified in 1994, and systematic excavation begins in 1995 as a cooperative project with the Schönlurfe Museum and the German Archaeological Institute. The earliest monumental phase, what archaeologists call Layer 3, belongs to the pre-pottery Neolithic A, when the great circular enclosures were already rising from bedrock. One of the strongest anchors we have for time comes from the architecture itself. A radiocarbon date taken from the wall plaster of Enclosure D returns 9,745 to 9,314 Cal BC, 95.4% confidence, placing that circle deep in the 10th millennium BC. So the question becomes brutally practical. How do you quarry, shape, and raise monoliths without metal, without wheels, and without beast of burden? You start by choosing the one advantage this hill gives you, the hill itself. The site sits on a limestone plateau, and the plateau is not just the stage, it's the quarry. The excavators can point to extraction zones on the same ridge where pillars were cut, and in several places, unfinished workpieces still lie where they failed. Pillars and blocks abandoned mid-process when flaws appeared. One gigantic T-shaped pillar left in the quarry measures about 7 meters in length, and the central pair in Enclosure D, already installed, measure about 5.5 meters and weigh about 8 to 10 metric tons each. And limestone has a secret. Even hard limestone can be worked efficiently with flint. The quarry marks show channels cut around the outline of a pillar. Stone Age masons likely used flint picks to dig those trenches, then exploited fault lines in the bedrock, using wooden beams and wedges to lift the block free. It isn't a miracle, it's geology, leverage, and ruthless patience. Transport is the next nightmare. Direct traces of hauling tracks haven't survived, but the distances matter. Many monoliths didn't travel miles. In some cases, the route may have been less than 100 meters. Even the longest pulls are estimated at roughly 500 meters. Ethnographic parallels for moving megaliths in other parts of the world point to a brutally simple toolkit: wooden sledges, planks, rope, and sheer manpower, reducing friction step by step. And then comes the part people underestimate: raising them. Even with only 10 tons, you don't lift a pillar like a statue. You build the lift, you dig a socket, you prepare the base, you use ramps, levers, and controlled rotation. Slow, incremental movements with dozens of hands correcting each inch. The engineering is primitive in tools, but advanced in planning, which leads to the real revelation. The technology wasn't a machine, it was coordination. You don't move 10 tons with genius. You move it with organization. Crews assigned to cut, shape, haul, feed, and repair. Leaders who can command time, not just people. And a shared reason powerful enough to keep everyone moving in the same direction. We can see the footprint of that system in what the mound is made of. Göbekli Tepe's sediments are not mostly soil. They're packed with limestone cobbles, animal bones, and massive quantities of worked flint. The kind of material you get when a place is used again and again by large gatherings. And the kitchen evidence is staggering. More than 600 stone vessels have been found at the site, including large limestone troughs up to about 165 liters, consistent with processing and cooking cereals at a scale far beyond a single family. In other words, this hill wasn't built by a lonely band. It was built by repeated events, people arriving, working, eating, and returning, until the impossible became routine. Over time, the architecture changes too. Later, Layer 2 brings smaller rectangular buildings tied to the early/middle pre-pottery Neolithic B, signs of a site that evolves, adapts, and persists. So forget the image of helpless nomads. What we're looking at is an early engine of cooperation, strong enough to turn belief into architecture. And once that engine exists, another question becomes inevitable. If they could organize this, what else were they organizing? Because in the next chapter, we're going back to the carvings, symbol by symbol, and ask whether these images are decoration or the survival manual of a world that was trying to make sense of a sky that betrayed it. We said we would return to the carvings. So now, we stop guessing, and we follow the pattern. Because at Göbekli Tepe, the animals are not random. They repeat. They cluster. They dominate entire spaces like banners in stone, almost like each enclosure is speaking in its own dialect. This is one of the most unsettling facts archaeologists keep coming back to. Each monumental circle seems to emphasize a different animal spectrum. In Enclosure A, snakes prevail. In Enclosure B, foxes dominate. In Enclosure C, boars take over. And in Enclosure D, birds become central, especially large birds of prey. The project researchers have argued these differences may reflect distinct social entities, different groups building, gathering, and performing rituals in their circle. that changes everything. Because it means Göbekli Tepe may not be a single tribe's temple. It may be a meeting ground, a shared sacred complex where multiple communities brought their identity, their myths, and their fears, then carved them into stone so they would outlast the storytellers. And the imagery itself is not gentle. The art at Göbekli Tepe is crowded with threat. Fangs, claws, stingers, talons, predators, venomous creatures, dangerous, wild power. Even when prey appears, it often appears inside a scene that feels like control, domination, or warning. In 2004, the early assessment by Joris Peters and Klaus Schmidt described the site as unusually rich in animal depictions, reliefs, sculptures, and decorated pillars, stressing that the meaning remains uncertain, but that interpretations being discussed include hunting rituals, initiation and passage rites, spiritual encounters, and even funerary practices. In other words, the iconography isn't pretty, it's functional, it's ritual technology. And here's where the evidence becomes impossible to ignore. Take Pillar 56 in Enclosure H. One side is packed with reliefs, and a detailed study notes a total of 55 animals so tightly arranged that the contour of one merges into the next. Ducks, snakes, quadrupeds, a bird of prey clutching a snake in its claws. This isn't decoration. This is a deliberate wall of symbols, layered and dense like a coded message. Then look at Enclosure D, the best dated of the Great Circles. A sample taken from the wall plaster gives a radiocarbon range of 9,745 to 9,314 Cal BC, 95.4%, placing the enclosure in the early PPNA. That means these symbols were carved almost 12,000 years ago, and they are already complex, already consistent, already part of a mature visual system. And inside that enclosure sits the pillar that refuses to be dismissed. Pillar 43. Researchers call it the vulture stone. Its broad face is covered in motifs, so many that even careful observers hesitate to claim a single meaning. But the scene is clear enough to disturb. A dominant vulture, a scorpion, multiple creatures, and a headless human figure depicted among the animals. The Penn Museum's excavation team notes that scenes like this exceed simple decorative purposes and likely carry mythological content, possibly narrative, possibly symbolic, possibly both. Now take one more step, because this is the step most people miss. The pillars are not just canvases, they are characters. Some T-shaped pillars show arms carved along their sides, hands meeting above the abdomen. Some even show belts and loincloths. That's evidence the T-shape is not an abstract post, it's an abstract body. So imagine the implication. These human-like pillars stand in circles, facing inward, while predators and dangerous animals cover their surfaces, as if the beings of stone are wearing the wild as armor. Maybe these animals were totems, markers of group identity. Maybe they were warnings, apotropaic symbols meant to repel evil. Maybe they were a ritual map, teaching initiates what must be hunted, feared, or mastered. The truth is, we don't get to pick the interpretation we like. We only get to follow what survives. And what survives is a consistent language of power. Wild animals, violent energy, and headless, faceless bodies at the center of everything. Which leads us to the most chilling fact of all. At some point, after centuries of use, they didn't abandon this language. They silenced it. Because the great enclosures of Layer 3 were intentionally backfilled, rapidly, deliberately, sealed under rubble, bone, and stone like a monument being erased on purpose. In the next chapter, we're going to examine that burial as evidence, not legend, because you don't bury a cathedral by accident. You bury it when you're trying to hide something, or protect something, or when you believe what's inside is too dangerous to leave under the open sky. You don't bury a cathedral by accident. And yet, that is exactly what happened here. Göbekli Tepe doesn't end with collapse or conquest. It ends with a decision, one of the most deliberate, labor-intensive decisions in early human history. The monumental enclosures were sealed beneath an ocean of debris until the sacred rings vanished from the world. This isn't a poetic metaphor. It's what the excavators physically removed. Enclosure D alone was packed with an estimated 500 cubic meters of fill, stone, bone, and broken flint piled in until the space became solid. Layer by layer, the same pattern repeats across the oldest monumental phase of the site. The great circles were not simply abandoned, they were backfilled. And the composition of the fill matters because it tells us how this was done. The material wasn't clean soil, it was limestone rubble, matching the quarry zones on the surrounding plateau, mixed with huge quantities of flint debitage, tools, and animal bones. The bones are so abundant that multiple researchers describe them as the remains of large-scale feasting, the kind of work feast that can gather hundreds of people, bind them socially, and mobilize labor for an extreme collective act. So picture what that means in real time. This wasn't a slow burial by wind and rain. This was an organized operation, a workforce returning again and again, hauling rubble from the quarry, dumping it into the enclosures, smashing bones for marrow, discarding flint from constant cutting and scraping, then repeating the process until the pillars disappeared. But the strangest detail is what seems to happen before the sealing begins. Excavation reports from the project describe evidence that the buildings were cleaned prior to backfilling. If any roofs existed, they were dismantled first, because no convincing traces of roofing were found in the enclosures themselves. It's as if the site was decommissioned with care and then entombed. And like any burial, the backfill wasn't purely trash. It contains intention. During the removal of the fill in Enclosure D, the team documented that special objects had been deliberately deposited near pillars, among them heads of anthropomorphic sculptures, not thrown in randomly, placed, as if the closing of the enclosure required offerings, or the final act of a ceremony we can't fully reconstruct. Then there's the evidence that makes the burial feel less like demolition and more like a sealed memory. Although formal graves aren't known at Göbekli Tepe, researchers have recovered hundreds of human bone fragments from the fill of the prehistoric buildings in nearby areas. A Science Advances publication in 2017 reported that this human material includes modified skull fragments, evidence consistent with a form of skull cult practice, suggesting that the dead, the head, and identity may have played a ritual role at the site. So now the burial reads differently, not as abandonment, as closure, a controlled ending. And that forces a final question that modern history still struggles to answer. Why? One possibility is practical. As the 10th millennium BC passed into the 9th, life in the region was changing. Architecture shifts at the site too. The later phase, Layer 2, brings smaller, more rectangular buildings, typical of the pre-pottery Neolithic B world. It's a different rhythm, a different use of space, a different society in motion. But that still doesn't explain why you would bury the past instead of leaving it behind. Another possibility is cultural. In some early Neolithic contexts, special buildings have biographies. They are raised, used, then ceremonially closed, sometimes by filling or sealing. If the enclosure is a living thing in the imagination of its builders, then burying it is not destruction. It's transformation. But the darkest possibility is this. They buried Göbekli Tepe because they were trying to protect something. Not gold, not technology, a memory, a lesson, a warning. Because if the hill was built in a world shadowed by climate shock, if the people who gathered here felt the sky itself could turn violent, then the act of sealing the enclosures becomes almost logical. The safest place for a dangerous truth is under stone, where it can't spread, can't be twisted, and can't be seen until a future age is ready to confront it. And that is why Göbekli Tepe is more than an archaeological site. It's a message with a lock on it, a civilization's first great monument, then its first great cover-up. So when we ask who built this, we're asking the wrong question. The real question is, what happened that made them bury the evidence of who they were? Because the builders didn't just leave behind pillars. They left behind a silence so heavy it took 12,000 years to dig through. And we are still not at the bottom. Today, in 2026, as we face our own global challenges, Göbekli Tepe has returned to remind us of our true potential. It tells us that we are capable of moving mountains without engines. It proves that we are capable of tracking the cosmic clock without computers. But most importantly, it warns us of how fragile civilization truly is. The people of the Belly Hill were masters of their world, yet they felt the need to bury their pride and disappear. They realized that progress without wisdom is a path to destruction. Looking at the radar data from this year, we see that we have barely scratched the surface. There are hundreds of pillars still waiting in the darkness. Each one of them is a page in a book of lost knowledge. Some fringe researchers suggest that if we were to uncover the entire site, we would find a message, a time capsule, specifically left for a generation that had rediscovered the technology to find it. They didn't bury it for themselves. They buried it for us. They wanted to ensure that if humanity ever reached the brink again, we would have a map of our origins to guide us home. The legacy of Göbekli Tepe is a call to action. It forces us to rewrite our textbooks, but it also forces us to rethink our future. We are not just a collection of accidental hunter-gatherers who got lucky. We are a species with an ancient and profound spiritual heritage. We are the architects of the impossible. From the first stone carved in 9,500 BC to the high-definition cameras documenting the site today, the thread of human curiosity remains unbroken. Thank you for joining us on this massive journey through time here at Relic of History. This investigation into Göbekli Tepe is just the beginning. The past is not a dead place. It is a living, breathing mystery that is only now starting to speak. As the sun sets over the Turkish hills, we leave the silent giants to their rest, knowing that we have uncovered only a fraction of the truth. If you found this journey as transformative as we did, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Your support allows us to keep digging deeper into the shadows of our past. What do you think was the real reason for the Great Burial? Was it fear, or was it a gift for the future? Leave your theories in the comments below. And this has been a journey through the oldest enigma on Earth. Stay curious, stay questioning, and remember, history is not what you were told, it is what you find. Until next time.